John Reeve, Managing Director of AgRee Commodities. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure, Todd.
John, you've had an extensive background in food and agribusiness, not only with primary production but also with risk and finance, having delivered programs for Standard Chartered, Rabobank, a lot of other banks around the Indo-Pacific. Really interested to hear your thoughts today on food security in the Indo-Pacific and some of the challenges we're facing.
Well, it's great to be here, Todd, and thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I've been involved in agriculture all my life. Done a bit of hedge advisory and worked for 5 banks for my sins, as you say. In the last 10 years, I've done consulting for government and trade houses and startups and so on, including for Palladium International in Timor-Leste around route to market work. So, I think there's no doubt that food security is linked to national security. But even going back a step from there, moving forward, climate change as well, I think, will impact food security and therefore national security.
Yeah, right. And so when we talk about climate change specifically, and also in the Southwest Pacific, I guess, where we hear a lot of, especially a lot of news around islands like Nauru and Palau, which are being affected by rising water levels. Now, obviously, climate's been changing for millions of years, but there are populations that are being affected, and their food sources are being affected by that as well.
That's exactly right. I was referring more to increasing climate variability, even just up on the hills in Timor-Leste and PNG. That's not affected by sea level rises, but that's the most acute example. Absolutely, would be the low-lying nations. And that would be, the most acute one in terms of national security as well.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so, mate, how do you, in your experience as well, especially working in those regions and also locally in Australia, how do you manage the risk and uncertainty for not only small crop farmers, but I guess large producers as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of what I've done in the last 10 years, for example, even more at home in Queensland, is written the individual business risk management plans for Queensland Department of Ag and done a bunch of other risk work here and abroad. And risk and uncertainty aren't the same thing. So risk can be identified and potentially mitigated. But if you're not doing a good job of that, then uncertainty can get on top of you, mentally and within your operations. And of course that can, lead through to, parties in the Indo-Pacific being more influenced potentially by other foreign actors that are, seem to be helping them more than we are in that respect. So specifically to your question, this day and age, most people, even up in the hills in the Indo-Pacific, which of course is a developing region, have access to mobile phones. So so there's the opportunity, and it is starting to happen in terms of weather risk management and so on. But it's all about preparedness. So the more capacity building around preparedness, the better, because it's harder to clean things up in hindsight.
Yeah. Interestingly, years ago, I was doing some work up in Nauru, and some various work for other governments and. For our government, I should say, not for other governments. But the local fishery there, it's one of the biggest yellowfin tuna fisheries in the world. And they didn't have the resources to really keep managing their own fishery, one. Two, they didn't have any processing facilities. And they saw the easy way out was to lease out the fishery to a foreign actor, so to speak, who were reaping the benefits of that particular fishery. But nothing was coming back to that. To that country, to Nauru, other than $1 million lease and a brand new fire truck, or something like that, and then you see these other countries, 737s flying in twice a day, filling it up with fish, taking it back to feed their own. Do you see more and more of that happening, not just in fisheries, but also how do you see that with small crops? Do you see much of that happening in the region as well?
Well, I'm not an expert in corruption, but obviously that needs to be considered when you see activity like that. What I am an expert in is agricultural supply chains and emerging markets, and developed markets and ag supply chains. But it's funnily enough, even in Australia, there's adversarial supply chains where producers may not be getting paid a fair price for their produce. So the important thing is data around prices, so price data, recording and transparency, and there's benchmarks in animal proteins. So you see the likes of this is at a more developed level, developed country level, but the likes of Argus and S&P even moving into Australia around some benchmarks around animal protein to fill voids with respect to price transparency. But if you've got price transparency, then you've got some visibility of what should be going back to the owners of the land, and things become a little bit more visible. So that's transparency is important in that respect. Yeah.
So that addresses, I guess, the risk exploitation as well for smaller farmers as well, so underdeveloped farmers.
Yeah, it does. And what will get a bit more complicated moving forward is the emissions transparency as well. So, in Australia, by way of example, but plenty of other countries around the world, climate risk mandates are going to be enforced increasingly from large companies to medium to smaller companies, and so emissions will be needed to be recorded effectively. Almost at a P&L level. Line item P&L. There'll be a dollar number, and there'll effectively be an emissions number as well. So the embedded carbon value, if you like, of physical ag commodities is going to become more important, and that sort of gets complicated. It all just comes back to data.
Yeah, right, data. And mate, you just recently, yesterday, attended an agricultural session summit
in Toowoomba.
Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so the Federal Ag Minister and Federal Climate Change Minister were both there. So people were invited from all around the country to the Toowoomba Showgrounds. Originally from Toowoomba, and it was a really good session. So the federal government had a ag and land sector plan. They're developing a plan for the ag and land sector, specifically around emissions, but also climate change and so on. And in fact, we've done a bit of analysis around some of the submissions with respect to that plan, and collaboration and partnerships was the number one thing that people are asking for. It sounds like a bit consulting and a bit cheesy, but it's very multifaceted and complex, some of these things, and so the right sort of collaboration is needed. And so we've my COO and I were up there yesterday, and we had some great conversations around setting the scene and exploring the role of agriculture in a low emissions future. Yeah.
Yeah, and you were mentioning earlier offline around the methane issue as well in the region. So, obviously that's not just related to Australia or confined to Australia. You talk about the Indo-Pacific, that includes the US, other larger nations. I mean, how are we in line with, I guess, our standards as compared to the US standards when it comes to managing, emissions as such?
I would say we're doing a reasonable job. We're possibly a little bit of a laggard, with the coalition government previously, perhaps being a little slow given our dependence on coal and beef and other things and gas that have a fairly large methane or a very large methane profile. Some listeners may not know that the carbon equivalent for 1 tonne of methane is about 28 units of carbon, so it's a fairly potent greenhouse gas. And the causes of methane, is leaks from coal mines, leaks from gas mines, and intensive agriculture, particularly beef and sheep. So all of those things you could put in a basket and say, here are the emergency brakes to climate change if there's some type of tipping point moving forward. So that's the risk that if you want to look forward, you need to start thinking through not getting to that point. So in other words, mitigating those emissions through practice change and through by speeding up production cycles, but also potentially feed additives and that sort of thing to use beef as an example. Yeah.
Right. So, mate, Australia was, so-called built off the sheep's back. We've then obviously relied heavily on mining. Agriculture as an investment over the last 10 to 20 years hasn't necessarily been sexy because the yields haven't been as high, but now there's a lot of technology coming back into Agri to I guess, improve yields, but also, production and value as well. Given the fact that, mining's only got a limited life when you think about it here in Australia, how reliant do we need to be on agribusiness as a commodity for export? Are we, we talk about being the food bowl of Asia. What do we need to do, I guess, to improve the sector to, I guess, stabilise or provide opportunity for the Australian economy as a producer?
I think it's complex, but the one metric of just price for commodity is more in the past now. There's going to be other metrics moving forward. I think the live cattle trade to Indonesia, I think, is important personally. I might leave the sheep one, the small sheep, all the way to the Middle East. You could argue is a tougher call, but Brahmins and drought masters to nearby Asian countries, I think, is an important thing to keep open. So that's a good example of an industry that is got some really good partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, which is our sort of core focus of this discussion. It creates trade and relationship and then even tourism and so on off the back of that. And a lot of jobs in feedlots and processing plants in Indonesia and so on. So I think, there's a lot of Australian agriculture and the Indo-Pacific is quite complementary. We've got different landscapes and different climate and we've got good technologies and good universities and good R&D groups that can produce not just agricultural commodities but also share those agricultural commodities with the region in a positive way. I think more could be done in that respect, and I certainly think a lot more could be done in terms of sharing the R&D that we're working on here and some of the technology we've got. We've got very similar landscapes and climates, particularly in the tropical north of Australia, to the Indo-Pacific, obviously, and other parts of the world like Africa that's desperately needs help in terms of food security that I know a little bit about. So I think in terms of the Future Drought Fund in Australia, for example, I mean, what extension is there? That's an Australian-focused thing. I think that's wrong. I think there's an obligation to make sure there's some connectedness to our nearer neighbours for national security reasons. There you go. And similarly, yesterday it was an Australian-focused ag summit. I think a small element, there was plenty of Indigenous recognition, which is good. But I think there should be a recognition that we're connected to our near neighbours. And there's a lot of good labour there. We've got labour problems in terms of processing of cattle, to use as another example. So whether the labour flies in and processes in southeast Queensland, this part of the world where there's a lot of processing capacity, or whether it's live export out of the north into Indonesia and potentially Vietnam as well to make use of their skills over there in the processing sector. So it was a wide-ranging question. Hopefully that wide-ranging answer was sufficient.
No. Poor question on my behalf.
Not at all.
So mate, I guess also, thinking about Indonesia and the live cattle trade export to Indonesia, we saw there was some disruption in that a while ago, and it affected producers
10, 15
here.
years ago,
10, 15 years ago, affected producers here. What effect does stopping the live cattle trade have on Indonesia if we stop sending live cattle from Australia?
Well, clearly they've got receival infrastructure and people and jobs associated with that, and transport to the feedlots that are owned or co-owned, and then the processing plants, and they process it in their own way, and it goes to their wet markets. They've got a very different system of retailing over there, with wet markets being very popular. So, in terms of the sheep live exports being banned most recently, I don't know, but I hope that some damage control was done in Kuwait and these places that enjoyed that good produce that made it all that way. Yeah. There's a lot of good news stories out there in terms of Australian agriculture integrating and co-investing with Indo-Pacific. So CBH over in Perth is the cooperative bulk handling, the large wheat producer or bulk handler and exporter, grower-owned, very large operation over there. Co-owns a flour mill in Indonesia called Interflour. More than one asset, in fact. And that's a good way of getting some sort of vertical integration that goes from our comparative advantage of producing in this case wheat in Western Australia and the comparative advantage of producing noodles in Asia and obviously the mouths there to feed. So whether it's the live X trade out of the north or the wheat trade out of the west, there's really good connectedness there into Indonesia, and you really need to think twice before getting in the way of that.
And we're obviously seeing a lot more of that. There's been a lot of talk in the past about foreign companies owning land and assets here to produce items to send back offshore. Interestingly, a large Thai corporation owns a lot of sugar mills here in Australia.
Mitpon is a large Thai sugar miller and a good company that I know very well. It was one of my best customers when I was in Singapore working with the banks. And they bought Maryborough Sugar Factory here in Australia that included a lot of land. In terms of the Chinese in the sugar sector, they bought Tully Sugar Limited that I've got a very strong connectedness to. And it's a very good mill. And I think, hasn't been all clean sailing, but my understanding is it's all still operating well. I think the mill's operating at close to full capacity, and the growers are getting paid, and it seems to work okay.
Are you seeing anything with, Chinese producers or Chinese landowners as an example? Are you seeing anything in the beef trade? I mean, they're not necessarily a big beef consumer. Are they more? Do you know if they're more interested in land? Are they interested in production? When we talk about the Chinese,
I think they're interested in food security, absolutely. In terms of beef and what drives the Chinese, there have been some Chinese investment into beef. They're a good market for Australian beef, but there is, you would seem there's some geopolitics played there from time to time in terms of being shut out of markets, which is what it is. But I think that trade seems to be operating pretty well again now. I think that the drivers for the Chinese, and particularly, by way of example, the Tully Sugar Mill was bought by COFCO, Chinese, the largest food company in the world, Chinese state-owned food company. I think they just want to make sure they can feed their people, but not specifically about China, but broadly about the population, including in Africa, which will have the largest, 13 of the 20 largest cities in the world in terms of population by the end of this century. It's what you eat, I think, is what we need to start really thinking about, because the sustainability of what we eat is the big deal. Right. Trying to produce more efficiently can be done to a point, but then it's the resources, the water, emissions, and other resources used to produce food is one thing, but it's there's plenty of literature out there saying that that the footprint of red meat, for example, is very high. So that needs to be considered. There's a lot of people out there preaching that we should eat less meat and more grains and so on in our diet. So it's not all about just pouring pressure back onto the landowner. There's some customer obligations there as well, which leads me to think about the retail side, and the messaging through there is just as important, and that equally links back to the core topic of today around Indo-Pacific food security and national security. So to extend what I mean by that, you could have a simple example could be a parent, a mother or a father that would go into a supermarket here in Australia with a couple of kids hanging off the trolley, and they're going to select an item let's say some a sauce that's got various ingredients, they might look at the sugar content and the price and throw it in because they're in a bit of a rush and the kids are playing up a bit. Where in future, we would expect the trend is clearly to be more food we purchased online, which gives the opportunity for frameworks and ratings agencies to come in and look at how more information, whether that be emissions, whether that be frameworks around sustainability more generally, or indeed matters, other matters that could link even back to national security, if you like, to make sure that we are buying things from our near neighbours that don't have the scale. And you and I have spoken a lot about Timor-Leste, for example, in the past. So I think that's where there's a lot of hope is around data and consumer choices, because the demand is what drives all these things. So,
well, it's interesting, mate. You mentioned like we have obviously known each other for a number of years and been kicking the tin around on a few projects. But you ideated a program, Pact Pacific and Timor, Bridge to Scale,
yes.
which was an amazing project to be part of. And that talks about provenance. That's back to provenance. Product to market as well, but creating value in the product for our, like you said, our near neighbours who might not have the infrastructure or the finance to be able to get their product to market, but creating that brand where, as you say, if someone's in a deli in New Farm and's willing to pay, over the odds for vanilla from Timor or red rice from Timor, which you've had a lot to do with, that does create a more secure region. It gives hope, obviously, to small lot farmers. Talk a little bit about that, if you could, for me, mate.
Yeah, sure. So I might go back. I'd be keen to do that. Just go back a step. And the way that came about was I was engaged by Palladium International, their market development facility, which is a DFAT-funded program, ultimately AusAid, basically, and went to Dili and around the countryside to the second largest city called Vaxa, which is worth a look if you ever go there. It was a beautiful Portuguese motel, and the team at MDF over there do a good job. So we were contracted to look into the route to market for three crops, particularly red rice, as you say, and mung beans and peanuts. And I would say that a lot of Australian contacts. I sat next to John Howard yesterday, not the ex-Prime Minister, but the ex-CEO of the Peanut Company of Australia, is currently the CEO of RIC. He was very kind, helping with some thoughts around the peanut sector and peanut market. And then similarly, there's a guy, Dale Reeves in Toowoomba, was very helpful on the mung bean piece. But specifically, red rice does seem to, and black rice seems to be an opportunity in Timor-Leste, and I was recontracted to go back with a team of 5 senior executives from Sunrise. Ed Thistlethwaite particularly was most helpful all the way. But there's not quite the scale there. Sunrise is an ASX listed company, and so I think to get to that sort of packed concept we had, some of the challenges in Timor and is common across the Indo-Pacific, with Timor probably being a bit of an acute example, is that, for example, a small landowner and most of the population, 70+%, live in a rural setting and are quite poor, and there's not, as you say, not great infrastructure in terms of roads and so on. There's no CBH over there, no cooperative bulk handling over there to arrange all the logistics and export of these things. So you need to take a creative niche approach to it and strategic approach to it. So the problems by way of example is that a red rice producer would produce enough for their family, and they'll produce a bit extra for the local wet markets that they'll take there and get a little bit of cash from the local market. The local community. But then occasionally there are traders, typically Indonesian traders, that would come over the border and would buy larger volumes and truck it back to West Timor and so on. But they wouldn't turn up every year. So there'd be when there was a good crop in East Timor, there's probably a good crop in West Timor, and the truck wouldn't arrive to take that surplus. So there's no incentive. Point being, there's no incentive to produce extra. So they never get export market going. They don't get that sort of US dollar proceeds, coming up country, which it would be really desperately needed. So the scale's not quite there. So the idea would be to try and aggregate a number of commodity lines concurrently and have coordinated offtake from larger corporates in Australia, food companies, even the Catholic community could make sure they put a bid out there and stay committed over a longer period of time. It doesn't have to be your whole meal doesn't have to be red rice. It could just be a small amount integrated into a meal process that underpins bids for produce that can create container loads of produce that comes out. So one of the big problems is, if you're just trying to do red rice, then you're only going to get part container loads, and it's just not efficient. So you need to aggregate and stuff containers full of a variety of things, and it needs to be adjusted seasonally. So the psyche we've got now in sort of the industrial farming area is that it's constant supply, exact quality, it's always available, and that's not what nature does, particularly with climate change coming. We need to be a little bit more flexible in terms of how we blend our blend food into the system in the western side. But the finance would come with a system like that with the right offtake. Offtake's critical. Maybe they should get a bit of a leg up to try to, whether that's a government leg up or whether that's Woolies and Coles helping promoting just a little bit of blended red rice in amongst a tropical rice pack or something that would help that bid be there to help things develop up country in these places. But they do a great job in the Solomons and other places with rice programs.
Yeah, Woolies and Coles could do with the brand
Good
equity
PR.
at the moment.
Well, we've got the highest retail concentration. That's not a joke. We've got the highest retail concentration of any country in the world. I think roughly 80% of food's purchased there. So they've got an obligation, absolutely, to try and be a little bit more sympathetic to help with the region. And as you mentioned, vanilla. Vanilla is a good little crop out of Timor-Leste. That's exactly the sort of thing that in some niche products could be blended in, and it wouldn't impact price hugely if it's just a small part of the ingredient. But that's the sort of thing that we need to do if we're serious about national security.
And you mentioned Timor. Obviously, they're heavily reliant on the on the gas exports at the moment. There's not a great deal else that they're able to sustain themselves with, so that then creates, I guess, an environment where they're having to put their hand out from other governments or from other agencies, USAID, so on and so forth, to help. So if you've got a stronger economy in the region and a secure economy in the region, you've got a stable population.
It's an acute example. Your word was great dependence. That's an understatement. Oil and gas is 99% of their foreign proceeds, and they've done a very good job of setting up a little sovereign wealth fund to hold some US dollars for that little country, but it'll dwindle down as the gas production winds up at some stage in the future, leaving there's a coffee industry, but it's sort of in decline. Which is where it really is, obviously important to try and cultivate, pardon the pun, rice and other crops where they've got some capacity. There's some manganese and some other mining opportunities there that Australia potentially could look at. That's not my strong suit, but certainly an assisted ag program would be the right thing to do. There's a very well funded scientific ag science sort of group there, but where the R&D falls down there is, in my opinion, is similar to where it falls down here in Australia, is really the commercial pull through. It's all well and good to sort of develop new seeds and that sort of thing, but unless you've got that commercial pull through, it's a waste of time, or it's not being used most effectively. And that pull through comes back to that offtake agreement we spoke about. You really need those. You really need that sort of demand there at the end of the day, rather than just the supply push of R&D onto the farmer. You need that demand pull so that there's an end-to-end solution there. Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier around diversity of crops and making choices about what we eat. In the region, we've got a growing ageing population. There's a growing Asian population, and the protein of choice is seafood for those categories of people. We've got a finite amount of wild-caught stock available in the Indo-Pacific. It's been raped, for want of a better term, over the last 30, 40 years, which leads to aquaculture.
Yes.
Obviously, if you can control the inputs and the outputs with aquaculture, there's some great species that are being grown here in Australia and offshore. Be it prawn, be it barramundi, as an example. Good high yielding fish as well. Low food conversion ratio, so you've got less impact on the environment.
Indeed.
But I don't know if you recall a couple of years ago when we were kicking around in Timor with MDF, and they asked us to look at helping a local company set up a aquaculture facility.
Yeah,
and so we helped them for obviously pro bono, because we wanted to help these to help these guys. But the route to market, I mean, we have enough trouble here in Australia getting barramundi from West Australia to the market in Sydney, because then you've got product that's 6 days old by the time it gets to Sydney, so the value of the stock is eroded. Let alone getting product with a unsophisticated supply chain as it is at the moment from Timor to market. Whether it's going north to
the
Singapore.
Phytosanitary issues and the lack of refrigerated supply chains is a problem.
Yeah. And whose problem is that? Is it a government's problem? Is it industry's problem? How do you solve a problem like that? One, to get more product to market. Two, to create industry in a region like Timor. It's not just Timor either. And three, to enhance that regional security.
Again, it's complex. I do a lot of work for KBR Engineering around pipelines and mega dams for irrigation in Australia, and obviously the cost benefit analysis is what you do as to whether you move ahead on it. Now those projects are largely government funded, federal, state, and it's my job to get as much private sector interest as possible. So I've got some perspective there. Whose job in the context of Timor and aquaculture? It gets complex because it's more than money. It is. It gets to to the national security topic of this conversation. So how you put a price on that is difficult. But I think what you need to do is you need to say, well, what are the alternatives? And it's partly what my paper did for just those three row crops, being red rice, mung beans, and peanuts. Saying, well, here's three. Where's the opportunity? And we decided that red rice and black rice had the opportunity. And to contrast that with the large investment you'd need for the aquaculture side, on the rice side, you just need a parboiler, which would be $500,000, just to get rid of some of the phytosanitary bugs, and then bang, it's on a boat and it's down in Australia getting blended, with some white rice from New South Wales, and away we go onto packs at Woolies and Coles, and that is conceivable and wouldn't come at a huge cost. I'm not an aquaculture expert. What I would say is that the intensification of agriculture is important, and part of that comes back to actually the natural capital side of things and trying to keep natural systems in place, or in fact increase the natural systems and not just environmental plantings, in grazing land that's possibly better under that sort of regenerative or regeneration system. But even on the coast, the aquaculture is great, but it can do a lot of damage to the mangrove and coastal areas, which, for example, places like Vietnam, a lot of the rice production's been taken out in favour of aquaculture, and there can be some negative consequences around that. But the intensification of agriculture generally is what needs to happen for increased efficiency. Yeah.
Well, there hasn't been a new aquaculture licence issued in Australia for over 20 years. So the environmental impacts, number one. The costs is obviously very high as well. So let alone some of our near neighbours as well who aren't as in good a position for route to market, but also the infrastructure to do it. So, but you mentioned as well, there's also quite a heavy impost on environment when it does come to that. But where's the balance? The cost, the environment, feeding people as well. And again, with large populations, Indonesia over 300 million, China 1.2 billion, India 1.3 billion. Every government, their main aim is to keep their people happy. Otherwise, there's uprising.
When we're right to look, Australia's not a huge country economically, so we tend to just look after our own backyard. But I would highlight that Africa again will have 13 of the 20 largest cities by the end of the century, is a massive structural net importer of food, believe it or not, despite their endowment of land and labour, imports hundreds of millions of dollars worth of rice and poultry and that sort of thing annually. So there's great opportunity there with things like the Common Agricultural, the CAPS project, the Common African Agro Parks project, and so on. That's supported by the African Union that we've had a little bit to do with. But again, how to get the right offtake and how to get all that funded is a big challenge, and that corruption word comes up again. So
it's funny. I mentioned him in one of our last episodes. Tim Marshall, who's one of my favourite authors of all time, and I was caught when I was last talking with a few other guests around the topics of his books, which I've read all of them and loved them. I think I was fanboying at the time, so I was a bit. But Prisoners of Geography, and he talks about why certain continents are successful and have been successful, and why others aren't. And you talk about Africa. The issues, what Tim clearly calls out in his book is, there's no interconnectivity with river systems or road systems. So you talk about route to market. Plus, you've got a number of countries in one continent where there's strife amongst a lot of them on their borders at all times. So when you say that there's 13 of the biggest cities in the world are going to be in Africa, that's going to pose a lot of challenges, a lot of mouths to feed, competition for land, competition for resources. That's going to be one to watch.
Yeah, indeed. And look, only to the extent that it, as an emerging market, it's relevant as a comparable to the Indo-Pacific, which is the purpose of this discussion.
Yeah.
We have recently been asked by the African Development Bank to look into a commodity basket and hedge strategies around how to create an African currency unit, because, as you say, it's all the different countries and their own currencies and the depreciation of those currencies and the hyperinflation. What they do have is resources, and so to sort of commit a percentage of their royalties into a pool that could be managed by the likes of the African Development Bank is one thing they're looking at to underpin a more stable currency and therefore enable them to borrow money to develop infrastructure. Because one of the problems is you borrow foreign currency and then you're trying to pay it back in the local currency that's nosediving is a recipe for disaster. So they're trying to underpin some of their currencies with or a new currency unit with a commodity basket, which is sort of, it is closer to my wheelhouse. Yeah.
Are they talking about like an African Union, like the euro, with a single currency for Africa?
It would be well endowed countries in Africa in terms of metals, including critical metals.
Right.
But potentially a bit of a modular in or out for fossil fuels, but that's by far and away the largest at the moment. But fossil fuels, gold. There's some big iron ore potential. Rio Tinto's going into Guinea. Huge iron ore potential there, but it's a function of those governments committing to a pool, and then they're part of a club, if you like. But that would have, you'd like to think that'd have some fringe benefits for some of the neighbouring countries, but it would not be all the countries. No.
Okay. Actually, you mentioned there with mining. If I could just circle back on that, obviously, folk like Gina Reinhardt, Twiggy Forrest, their organisations have invested in a lot of Agri land.
Yes.
Are you seeing any other large public listed organisations like BHP and Rio? Do you know much about any of their Agri strategies? Do they have any interest in Agri products? I mean, obviously you can only keep digging for a certain amount of time, but do you know if they're looking towards diversifying any of their interests into food?
No, it would be the short answer. I'm not seeing that. What they all do have is a lot of sort of grazing land around their mines themselves, so they tend to have one guy and maybe a few henchmen, that run the cattle around, but really that's just a buffer zone between them and the rest of the world. Glencore does have an ag trading division, but they're more a trading company in the ag side, not producers. But I think in terms of Mrs. Reinhardt and Mr. Forrest, it's more personal interest that they've gone into the cattle side of things. But they're not making any more land, as they say, and there's huge competition for land now that we've got the convergence of nature and trying to value nature through natural capital. You've got wind and solar, you've got agri, you've got mining, you've got urban sprawl. It's getting complicated, and I think that again, a little bit like how do you measure up? Where do you need some frameworks to and some co-design the right policies to make sure that we end up in the right place in that respect. Yeah.
Mate, talking of cattle as well, I recall having a discussion with you a while ago about building a cattle futures. Is that something you're still working on?
It is. In fact, it's risen close to the top of things at the moment. Yeah. So the Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, which you can Google and have a look at, went from $11 to $3 in about a year. And there's financiers out there that will lend money against cattle. And so you had, normally the risk mitigant there is that the cattle put on weight and that offsets any sort of market fluctuations. But when you get it going basis, the EYCI, Eastern Young Cattle Indicator, from $11 to $3, you'll sell your cattle and you still owe the financier some money. So that's a problem, and I think it's an unsustainable problem. Things like environmental plantings, because the buyers of carbon credits are often oil and gas companies with sophisticated treasuries and know about futures and options and long-dated hedges and so on, and offtake. They're quite sophisticated. So you'll get up to a 9-year prepaid swap on environmental plantings, which is competing for the same land that cattle are on. And in the cattle sector, there is no well-established commercial benchmarks or risk transfer. In fact, after my Malay white paper, we have had a UK group called Argus Media, which is a good group, but they typically step in places like the Black Sea and other places where there aren't strong governments or industry organisations to solve opaque markets. And so they've hired a person in Dolby to ring around and create a cattle feeder steer index, and they're now turning around to the industry and charging them for that. So I think the industry is quite rightly saying, well, aren't we paying taxes and levies and other things to to have indexes like that? So that one is, and then of course we've got as we mentioned earlier, the ban of the live sheep trade. So I think cattle and sheep both need a lot more price data recording and transparency. They are adversarial supply chains by way of history. Where you've got your graziers upstream and the processors downstream. But I think for the betterment of the whole industry, particularly now that we've got the environmental plantings piece, competing for land, that needs to be solved as a matter of urgency to at least create a level playing field between food security and the climate change piece. Yeah.
And mate, we talk about, obviously with developed nations, we've got a lot more access to data. Technology, the Internet of Things, especially now in agribusiness, and there's a lot of development in technology in agri over the last 10 years specifically. How do we get data visibility, reporting mechanisms, and I guess even education to our near neighbours who wouldn't necessarily have the same infrastructure we have here around technology? So, for example, Timor, Southwest Pacific, folk who are, I guess, a little disconnected geographically from Australia or the US as major partners. Have you come across any of these types of problems around knowledge and education
Yeah.
and data transfer, so that they know what they're
Mm.
growing, how they're growing it, improvement.
Yeah, capacity building, I think, is a problem here as it is in Indo-Pacific. Let me come at that question like this. I think the R&D groups do a pretty good job in Australia on the science-based stuff and in terms of data recording and the production side of things. Where it really falls over is on the business risk side, which is my side.
Yeah.
And I'm probably an authority on that, I would say, given the number of contracts I've had on business risk or, price benchmarks or, risk transfer and so on. And it's very real. I think shifting focus to Indo-Pacific and further afield where relevant, I think you've got to look for the common elements. The common elements of what we're already doing here, and make sure that gets over to where it needs to be. So specifically, what I mean by that is DAF in Canberra, could be funding projects through the Future Drought Fund here in Australia that would have benefit in PNG and Timor-Leste and so on. There should be an overlay to make sure that's picked up and transferred. I think we should really make sure, for national security reasons, that there's no silos between departments in Canberra in terms of how things could be extended, not just on into the field in Australia, but where relevant, where there are the common elements into the fields in the Indo-Pacific. So common elements is weather and forecasting and agronomics and seed varieties and agronomic stuff. But it also can come down to some of the risk management stuff. Some of the insurance elements that insurance products that could help with reducing risk and improving food security in those parts of the world. I think the big leap that needs to be made is into the commercial side, and you've got to start thinking like a merchant, and where there's gaps, there's a role for government to step in and make that happen, and also encourage corporates to step up and create that offtake that's needed.
Mate, with your time that you had at the various banks you've worked with, Standard Charters, Goldman Sachs, Rabo, they're obviously very invested in the region, in the Indo-Pacific. What sort of products or platforms do they have to help, I guess, emerging farmers, emerging producers in the region from a finance perspective, and also when we talk about route to market? I mean, how are they helping their customers in those regions to build stronger businesses and secure supply chains?
Great question. And you're referring to the Indo-Pacific, not Australia, to be clear. So there's a big difference in the banks I've worked at. So like Standard Chartered Bank is really in country in Asia, and is the largest bank in Bangladesh, foreign bank in Bangladesh by a factor of 3, and really stamps all the LCs, stamps a lot of the LCs of cargoes going in and out. And so Stanchart is the lifeblood of many of these countries to some extent. And so and the likes of Goldman have no country limits even for some of these countries. So plays a different role. But they all play a bit of a role. So let me give you an example. So when I was at Goldman, we looked carefully and traded natural rubber. So natural rubber is one of the largest exporter of natural rubber in the world is now Indonesia. And similarly with palm oil, they're big crops, tree crops, and helping those markets operate better with finance and risk transfer. That does filter down to the people that are involved on the ground at a production level. By way of price signals and better, more stable prices, and then for Standard Chartered, it's much more practical. They're in country and financing traders like Olam who go in country. I mean, Olam's had some presence, I think, it certainly has had some presence in Timor-Leste. So it's more sort of third parties that they're financing that help the wheels go around, so to speak, in those markets. But I think, certainly Standard Chartered Bank's got a very very clear focus from the CEO, particularly down around emissions and sustainability. So the metrics they start to put on the financing of these trade houses around emissions, and then emissions turns into nature and turns into other sort of UN sustainability goals, is a really interesting place to watch, because that's your funding to a large degree can help change practices and improve things.
Mate, you mentioned Olam as an example as well. They're a very big player in the region. Obviously, have a lot of responsibility towards their growers and everyone involved in their supply and value chain. They've got a very good reputation as well. What sort of, responsibility would you say that organisations like Olam have towards growers in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to corporate social responsibility, modern slavery, even quality control, imposts on growers as well? So when you talk about acceptance rates of products, quality, what responsibility do you think they have towards those, to their stakeholders, I should say, in the supply chain?
Well, I think the shareholders and stakeholders is probably the answer to that. So shareholders want them to make money, increasingly in a good way, but some of their stakeholders would have expectations of them that are degrees of not feasible. And the other thing is the practical reality of operating in some of these markets is different to what people in West End in Brisbane or in Melbourne might think should be done. I think, but there is a big obligation on them to because they are in a sense maybe not the only bid, but they're the most recognisable international bid for cashew nuts and all sorts of other grains and nuts and so on in these places. And they've got some big backing from the likes of Temasek, which is a Singaporean sovereign wealth fund, is a large shareholder in Olam, and they would have those sort of expectations. But they do need to make money.
So John, what are the key takeaways from our discussion today?
Well, I think what Australia does really well is a lot of research and development. We've got great universities, we've got great RDCs, so research development corporations, that really support our agriculture and food industries in a smart way. And a lot of that in a science level gets extended well, but it does fall down in a commercial and business risk sense. So what's really important to take away from this discussion is that transparency is our friend, particularly around price risk transparency and what prices are being paid for things, and that extends through to our friends in the Indo-Pacific, and trust. And what helps trust is trade. And tourism and that that transparency to make sure that no one's running off with too much of the pie.
John, mate, thanks for coming today. It's always a pleasure catching up. We could talk for hours.
Indeed.
But look forward to catching up with you again to talk about some other topics.
Sounds good.
But mate, thank you again.
Thanks, Todd. We'll see you again soon.
Cheers. Ta.